Hi everyone, welcome to Mind the Gap. I'm Jan and I'm here with Casey. If this is your first time listening to us, we usually talk about everyday English, the kind of language people actually use in daily life, and the little things that can make learning English a bit easier.
Speaking of little things, I had a funny moment with English recently. I was watching a video and heard the word stunning. I remember thinking, oh, I know this word, I learned it before. But when I wanted to use it later, it was just gone.
It disappeared at the exact moment you needed it.
Exactly. And that happens to me more often than I'd like to admit. I can recognize a word when I see it. I might even remember the Chinese meaning. But when I try to say it in a sentence, my mind goes blank.
That phrase, my mind goes blank, is actually a perfect way to describe that feeling. You know the answer somewhere in your head, but you just can't find it at that moment.
Yes, exactly. It's almost like the word is hiding from me. And the frustrating part is, I feel like I've already done the work. I wrote it down, I reviewed it, and I spent time trying to remember it.
I think that's where a lot of learners get stuck. They look at a forgotten word and think, maybe I'm just bad at remembering things. But honestly, forgetting words is a very normal part of learning a language.
That's actually quite comforting to hear, because sometimes I joke that my memory is like a sieve. I learn a word today, and somehow a few days later it has disappeared.
A memory like a sieve is a funny expression for that. But I think the important thing is this. Forgetting doesn't mean the word is useless or that you failed. It just means the word hasn't become familiar enough yet.
So maybe the problem isn't that we can't remember words. Maybe we're just trying to learn them in a way that doesn't really help our brains keep them.
That's exactly the question we're going to explore today. Because remembering vocabulary isn't just about seeing a word again and again. There's a little more to it.
Well, now I'm curious. Because if writing a huge vocabulary list isn't the answer, I'd really like to know what actually works.
Well, let's start with the first thing we need to understand. Why do words disappear from our memory in the first place? Before we talk about how to remember words better, I think there's something important we need to understand first. Sometimes we treat forgetting like a problem. We think, I forgot this word, so I must have done something wrong. But actually, our brains are doing something quite natural.
So you're saying forgetting is not always a bad thing? Because honestly, I always thought forgetting meant the information didn't stay in my brain.
That's what many people believe, but the brain is a little more complicated than that. Think about everything you see and hear in one day. The conversations you have, the signs you notice on the street, the things you read online, even small details you don't pay attention to. Your brain is constantly receiving information.
That's true. If I think about it, I probably forget hundreds of little things every day.
Exactly, and that's actually a good thing. If your brain tried to remember every single detail, it would become overwhelmed. It has to decide what information is important and what information can be left behind.
So our brains are kind of cleaning up, like keeping the important things and getting rid of the unnecessary ones.
Yes, that's a good way to imagine it. There's actually a well-known idea in psychology called the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. Don't worry, it sounds more complicated than it really is. It simply shows that people naturally forget information over time if they don't revisit it.
So this isn't just something that happens to people learning English?
Not at all. It happens with almost everything we learn. You could memorize someone's name, learn a new recipe, or study a new skill. If you don't come back to that information, your memory of it can become weaker. That's why forgetting is actually part of learning.
I like that phrase, forgetting is part of learning, because it changes the way we look at it. Instead of thinking, oh no, I forgot again, maybe we should think, okay, I just need to meet this word again.
Exactly, and that idea is really important. A word doesn't become part of your vocabulary just because you saw it once. It becomes stronger every time you meet it again, especially when you see it in different situations.
That actually makes me feel better. I used to see forgetting as proof that I wasn't learning properly, but maybe I was just expecting too much from my memory.
I think a lot of learners feel the same way. And there are some interesting expressions we use when talking about memory. For example, if someone forgets things easily, they might jokingly say, "I've got a memory like a sieve."
A sieve? Like something you use in the kitchen?
Exactly. A sieve has little holes, so things can easily fall through. It's a funny image, isn't it? Your memory is like a sieve, and some information just slips away. Of course, it doesn't mean your memory is actually bad. It's just a playful way to describe forgetting things.
I think many language learners can relate to that, especially when you learn lots of new words in a short time.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the next part. Because if forgetting is normal, the next question is, how can we help our brains keep the words that really matter?
You know, after talking about forgetting words, I think I've realized something quite interesting. Sometimes I say, I forgot this word, but maybe that's not completely true. Because when I see the word, I actually know it. It's familiar. I'm not looking at a completely new word.
That's a really important opposition. There's actually a difference between recognizing a word and being able to use a word. They might feel like the same thing, but they're two different skills.
So basically, my brain knows the word, but my mouth doesn't?
That's actually a very good way to put it. A lot of learners have a much bigger vocabulary when they are reading or listening than when they are speaking. They can understand far more words than they can naturally produce.
That explains a lot. I've had so many moments where I'm watching an English video and thinking, oh, I know that word. Then someone asks me to use it in a sentence, and suddenly I'm struggling.
That little moment of struggle is actually quite normal. Imagine you meet someone at a party. You might recognize their face the next time you see them, but that doesn't mean you remember their name, their job, or what you talked about. Words are a bit like that.
I like that comparison, because I think that's exactly what happens with vocabulary. I collect words, but I don't always build a relationship with them.
That's a lovely way to describe it. This is where many learners get trapped. They focus on the meaning of a word, but they forget that words don't usually live alone. They live inside sentences and situations.
I think I'm guilty of that. For example, I used to learn words like this. Write the English word, write the Chinese meaning, then move on to the next one. It felt like I was making progress because the list kept getting longer.
And that feeling can be quite misleading. A long vocabulary list looks impressive, but knowing a translation is only the first step. Take the word reserve. If you only learn reserve means you dear, that's not wrong. But when you're actually in a restaurant, you probably won't just say reserve.
Right, you need the whole sentence. Something like, I'd like to reserve a table for 2.
Exactly, because now the word has a situation around it. You can imagine the restaurant, the person you're speaking to, and the reason you're using the word. That makes it much easier for your brain to remember.
That actually makes me think about the word run. It's such a simple word, but it appears everywhere. I learned run as pao, but then I heard people say things like run a business or run out of time, and I was completely confused.
That's a perfect example. A word is not just a single meaning. It's more like a group of connections. The more situations you meet a word in, the more natural it becomes.
So when I come across new words, maybe I shouldn't just write down the meaning. Maybe I should pay more attention to how people actually use them.
That's the key idea. Actually, come across new words is a really useful phrase itself. It means you find or meet something unexpectedly. For example, I often come across new words when I watch English videos.
I like that because it feels much more realistic. You're not sitting there trying to collect thousands of words. You're just meeting them naturally, again and again.
And that's a big shift in the way we think about vocabulary. Learning a word isn't really about putting it into your notebook. It's about slowly making it part of your own English.
That makes me think of another question, though. If learning words in context is so important, how often do we actually need to see a word before it becomes ours?
That's a great question. And it brings us to the next part. Because remembering words isn't only about how you learn them once. It's also about what happens after that first meeting.
I think this is the part many learners are probably waiting for. If simply writing words down and memorizing translations isn't enough, then what should we actually do? Because I don't want to spend hours learning vocabulary and then forget most of it a few days later.
That's a fair question. I think the first thing we need to change is the way we see vocabulary. A word isn't something you simply put into your memory once. It's something you build a connection with over time.
So it's less like memorizing a fact and more like getting familiar with something.
That's why context is so important. Take the word appointment. Many learners see it and write down one meaning, 预约 or 约会. There's nothing wrong with that, but the word is still quite empty.
Empty? What do you mean by that?
I mean, your brain has the information, but it doesn't have much to connect it to. A much better way is to learn it through a real situation. For example, I have a doctor's appointment tomorrow. Now you can imagine the scene. You're talking about your schedule. You're going to see a doctor. And there's a reason you need that word.
That actually feels different. Because when I only remember appointment equals 预约, I know the meaning, but I don't really know when to use it.
That's the difference between knowing about a word and knowing a word. One is information. The other is experience. The more experiences your brain has with a word, the stronger that word becomes.
Alright, so the first step is learning words in situations. But what about the next problem? Even if I learn a sentence today, I might forget it next week.
That's where repetition comes in. But not the kind of repetition where you say a word 50 times in one evening and never look at it again. Our brains respond much better when we meet information again after some time has passed.
I'm guilty of that one. Sometimes I get really motivated and think, right, today I'm going to learn 100 new words. Then a few days later, I can barely remember any of them.
I think a lot of people have had that experience. The problem isn't your motivation, it's that your brain needs time to strengthen those memories. A smaller amount, reviewed regularly, often works much better.
So instead of learning 100 words once, it's better to meet 10 words several times.
That's the idea. You might learn a word today, see it again tomorrow, come across it in a video next week, and then use it in a sentence later. Every time you meet it, your brain gets another reminder. This is important. Keep this.
I like that idea of meeting a word. It makes learning feel less stressful. You're not forcing yourself to remember everything immediately.
That's the feeling we want. There's another important piece. Using the word yourself. Because understanding a word is passive, but producing it is active. That's why speaking, writing, or even making a simple sentence can make such a difference.
So basically, looking at a word isn't enough. I need to actually do something with it.
That's the key. A phrase I really like is, practice makes progress. People often say, practice makes perfect, but honestly, perfection isn't really the goal when learning a language. The goal is to become a little more comfortable every time you practice.
That feels much more realistic. Because sometimes learners are afraid of making mistakes, so they never actually use the words they learn.
Mistakes are actually part of the process. When you try to use a word and realize something feels wrong, that moment can be very useful. Your brain pays attention because it notices a gap.
I suppose that's why just reading vocabulary lists never really worked for me. The words were there, but they weren't connected to anything.
That's a great way to put it. A word becomes easier to remember when it has a story, a situation, or a purpose behind it. So instead of asking, "How many words did I learn today?" a better question might be, "How many words did I actually make part of my English?"
I think I can see the pattern now. The problem was never just about learning new words. It was about what happens after I learned them. But I have to admit, this is probably the hardest part for me. I can feel motivated for a few days, make a big plan, and then somehow my routine disappears.
I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges for learners. People often focus on finding the perfect method, but sometimes the real challenge is simply staying with it. A simple method you can continue doing is usually much more powerful than a perfect method you only do for 1 week.
That sounds familiar. I've definitely had those moments where I get really excited and think, this time I'm going to change everything. Then I create a huge vocabulary plan, maybe 50 or 100 words a day. And after a while, I just can't keep up.
I think many people know that feeling. There's nothing wrong with having ambition, but sometimes we make learning harder than it needs to be. 10 words that you truly learn and use are often more valuable than 100 words that you forget a few days later.
So the goal isn't really to learn as many words as possible every day.
Not necessarily. Vocabulary is a little bit like exercise. If you suddenly do a very difficult workout once, you might feel motivated at first, but it's hard to maintain. A smaller habit that becomes part of your life is much easier to keep.
I like that comparison, because nobody expects to get fit after going to the gym once. But with English, people sometimes expect to remember a word forever after seeing it once or twice.
That's a really interesting point. Language works in a similar way. Your brain needs regular contact. A word becomes stronger when it keeps coming back into your life. Maybe you see it in a video, hear it in a podcast, read it in an article, or use it in a conversation.
That actually sounds much more natural. Instead of thinking, I need to sit down and memorize thousands of words, I can just pay more attention to English around me.
That's where daily exposure becomes important. For example, if you enjoy watching a series, don't feel like you need to stop every few seconds and write down every new word. Sometimes it's enough to notice a word, understand the situation, and let your brain meet it again later.
That's actually quite different from how I used to study. I thought every new word had to go into a notebook immediately, otherwise I was wasting the opportunity.
I understand why people do that. Writing things down can be useful, but the notebook itself isn't the goal. The goal is for the word to become part of your routine. You're not collecting words like items in a box, you're building a relationship with them.
So how would you actually make vocabulary part of your routine? Because I think that's where many people struggle.
I'd keep it simple. Maybe spend 10 minutes every day reviewing a few words. Not because 10 is a magical number, but because it feels manageable. You can use flashcards, a notebook, or even a note on your phone. The important thing is having a regular moment when you come back to those words.
That word, regular, actually feels important. Because I think I always focused on doing a lot, not doing something consistently.
That's often the difference. A lot of progress in language learning comes from small actions repeated many times. There's a phrase, stick with it, which means to continue doing something even when it becomes difficult or less exciting.
I like that phrase, because honestly, motivation comes and goes. Some days I'm excited about English, and some days I just don't feel like studying.
That's completely normal. The people who make progress aren't always the people who feel motivated every single day. They're usually the people who have made learning part of their routine. Once something becomes a habit, you don't have to rely on motivation all the time.
So instead of asking, how can I learn more words? Maybe I should ask, how can I make English appear more often in my life?
That's probably the better question, because when English becomes part of your daily routine, vocabulary stops feeling like something you have to force into your brain. It becomes something you naturally meet again and again. Well, I think we've covered quite a lot today. If there's one thing I hope people take away from this conversation, it's that learning vocabulary isn't really about forcing yourself to memorize hundreds of words. It's about giving words enough time, enough context, and enough chances to become part of your own English.
I really like that idea. Because at the beginning of this episode, I was thinking, why do I keep forgetting words? But now I think a better question is, how can I help my brain remember them naturally?
That's a much healthier way to look at it. Sometimes learners put a lot of pressure on themselves and expect every new word to stay forever after 1 or 2 attempts. But language doesn't really work that way.
I think that's probably the biggest lesson for me today. Don't panic when a word disappears. Just meet it again. Maybe the next time I see stunning, I won't feel like I failed. I'll just think, there you are again.
I think that's a lovely attitude. Learning a language is a long journey, and the small things you do regularly are usually the things that create real progress. So, take your time, keep exploring, and don't forget that every word you meet is another small step forward.
Before we go, I just want to say thank you for spending this time with us. Whether you're learning English for work, exams, travel, or simply because you enjoy the language, I hope today's conversation gave you a little more confidence.
If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe to Mind the Gap and share it with someone who's also learning English. Sometimes a small reminder or a useful idea can make someone's learning journey a little easier.
We'll be back next week with another conversation. Until then, keep listening, keep learning, and hopefully you'll come across some lovely new words along the way. See you next week.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Take care and cheers.